There's a story out of the Seattle Times that actually, to me, disproves the notion that leftists actually believe that housing should be free. This story is crazy. I don't like to read a lot from stories on the show because I don't want to bore you, but this is crazy. So the Seattle Times does a story on how, this is the headline, unpaid rent in low-income housing skyrocketed, and evictions may be next. So the whole premise of this story is about how in low-income housing complexes, that over the last few years in particular, the balances of unpaid rent are insane. And it's causing, imagine that, all sorts of problems. It's hurting the ability of these low-income housing providers to be able to build more housing because they're not bringing money in, right? And it's so bad, in fact, that these leftist organizations want the government to make it easier for them to evict some of these low-income people who aren't paying rent. I'm going to read from this article for you. In Seattle and across the country, nonprofits that operate low-income housing face a skyrocketing balance of unpaid rent. In the Seattle area, the total rent debt across all tenants is estimated at $170 million, the vast majority of it belonging to low-income households. Across the country, the total is almost $10 billion. Many housing providers say the amount of overdue rent has grown dramatically since before the pandemic and is hurting their ability to maintain and build more affordable housing in a region and nation that is starved for it. These organizations, whose missions include bringing and keeping people off the street, have begun to evict non-paying tenants to bring in paying ones. Well, imagine that. Oh, isn't that capitalism? Oh, we got to make money. You can't give them this unit for free. So this person that I brought in from the streets and they're not paying rent, like, you got to go. I got to bring in somebody who's actually going to pay rent. Some fear more evictions are on the way. Housing providers have been meeting with local, state, and federal officials to come up with solutions, and in some cases, asking to make it easier to evict tenants. Gee, and we know that these homeless service providers, by and large, especially in the Seattle area, are leftists. 100%. And it's really odd because as we talk about just, private sector landlords who are dealing with these insane situations where tenants are taking them for 2 years worth of rent, the leftists don't speak up. They paint that as evil landlords. Interesting, but now it's the leftist organizations and the nonprofits that are bringing people in off the streets that are saying, we need to make it easier to evict these people. So you want to evict the poorest people. Wow, very woke of you. The Seattle Times article goes on, wait before you do it, Nicole, because you haven't read this. What do you think some people blame?
COVID.
Oh, good job. Always COVID, yeah. I'll give it to the Seattle Times, though. It moves past that argument pretty quick into an argument that is actually true. Okay. So it says the increase in unpaid rents can be traced to the pandemic, which was a hurricane of economic disruptions, especially at the lowest rungs of the ladder. For the love. It'll be 2045, and there'll still be the lingering economic impact on poor Americans from the pandemic. And then, meanwhile, they say nothing at all about like the rising cost of gas and the Climate Commitment Act, none of that. So anyway, but then it goes on to what the truth was and what coincided with the pandemic. What else started during the pandemic? Protections for renters. Not just protections, but renters were shielded from eviction if they weren't paying rent, even if they didn't have to prove need, even if they had the same job and the same income that they did before the pandemic started. And I'll give credit to the Seattle Times and some people they spoke to were say this is it. It wasn't the pandemic that caused this. It was the policies passed in the pandemic. It says much of the low-income housing industry believes that government programs designed to shield renters from the economic impacts of the pandemic created a habit of not paying rent. In 2020, an eviction moratorium was enacted where landlords were prohibited from kicking out tenants with few exceptions. If a tenant stopped paying rent, their balance of unpaid rent would grow, but they could stay in their home for as long as the moratorium was in effect. Then, pandemic relief funds provided one-time rental assistance that wiped the slate clean for many tenants. Housing providers said a significant number of tenants are still not paying because they got used to spending their income on other needs or maybe hoping for more rental assistance. That's exactly what happened. Mm-hmm. And it's not just in the low-income areas. It's not just in low-income housing. We've been screaming. All of a sudden, the Seattle Times and these groups want to pay attention to this because it's low-income housing and low-income people and formerly homeless people who are going to get booted out because they didn't pay rent. When we've talked about hardworking Washingtonians who have a rental unit here and there, and they've had people in there taking advantage of the laws, these same laws, using the same COVID-era laws to just steal a place to live. So now it's like they're finally coming around because they also see the ripple effects of what happens when people don't pay rent. Excessive rent loss will decimate Seattle's community of nonprofit housing providers. We will not have the financial resources to maintain the housing, make mortgage payments, or meet the obligations of our lenders. Interesting. So you're telling me if people don't pay rent to you, you're going to be in a difficult position? You won't have the financial resources to maintain housing or make mortgage payments to meet the obligation of your lenders? It says the shortfalls are also making it more difficult to add new affordable housing, said Lisa Vatsky, a director of the Washington State Housing Finance Commission, a state agency that oversees public funding and programs for housing. Banks are increasing requirements for organizations to receive loans for new affordable housing projects because they see the unpaid rent balances as a high risk, which ultimately decreases the number of units being built. I cannot make a better argument than these leftist organizations are making for why you have to make sure people are paying rent, why landlords have to have the ability to evict people in a reasonable and timely manner. Look at the societal ripple effect from this. You've got people who were, in some cases, formerly homeless. You get them into low-income housing. They don't pay rent or they stopped paying rent because of the policies that were put in place. Those policies protected them, sometimes for a year or 2 years, where they wouldn't be evicted. Then all of a sudden, they've got this big bill of back due rent that they can't pay. And if they can't pay it, then the low-income housing providers, they can't meet their obligations to lenders. And if they can't meet their obligations to lenders on these properties, why would lenders give them loans for more properties? And the governor says we're in a affordable housing crisis. Well, gosh, it seems like you can find a connection between the affordable housing crisis and our protections for deadbeat tenants. Now, I'll also say, one of the things that occurred to me in reading this is also the result of this housing first mentality when you have people on the streets. Of saying, oh, just put a roof over their head and everything else will come naturally. That's just not true. If you throw someone in a house and you haven't gotten any help for them, meaningful help for the reasons they were homeless in the first place, usually drug addiction or mental health, you think that they're going to be able to maintain a steady job, upkeep the unit, or anything like that? No, they're just going to wind up back on the streets. They're not going to pay you rent. So that's part of it too, is putting the cart before the horse. Like, let's get these people help. Let's make sure when you do put them into one of these available low-income units, that they have their feet underneath them, they've got gainful employment, and they're going to cut rent checks. And that the law doesn't protect them in a way where they don't have to cut rent checks for years and years. It's interesting, again. Maybe housing isn't a human right. Maybe you have to pay for housing. Because if you don't pay for housing, then you're robbing someone else of housing. Interesting stuff.